The HOA thought they had this in the bag. A former royal guard dared to place a statue in his yard, violating their aesthetic guidelines. So, they dragged him to court, expecting an easy win. Big mistake. What they didn't know, this wasn't just any homeowner. Nigel had spent years guarding royal palaces, memorizing complex legal codes for court-martial scenarios. And today, he was about to use that knowledge to annihilate their entire case, without even breaking eye contact. The Crestwood Homeowners Association was infamous, not for well-kept lawns, friendly neighborhood potlucks, or even slightly aggressive parking rules. No, this HOA had ascended to a new level of pettiness. If Dante had written a 10th circle of the underworld, it would have been reserved for people who sent violation notices for excessively festive holiday decorations or unauthorized placement of potted plants. Enter Nigel Whitmore. Nigel was, by all appearances, an unassuming British expat in his mid-50s with the posture of a man who could balance a teacup on his head through a hurricane. He'd moved into Crestwood 6 months prior, quietly purchasing a quaint 2-story home with a precisely manicured lawn and a garden so impeccably trimmed that even the HOA couldn't find fault with it. For a time, he flew under the radar. He paid his dues, attended no meetings, and responded to neighborly small talk with a polite but firm nod that communicated, "Yes, I hear you," and "No, I will not be engaging in this conversation further." Then, one fateful morning, everything changed. At precisely 7 a.m., HOA President Deborah Langley, a woman whose primary source of joy seemed to be issuing citations, arrived at the end of Nigel's driveway, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her target? The latest violation that had been reported by an anonymous, but definitely her, HOA member. A life-size statue stood on Nigel's front lawn, positioned near the walkway, facing the street. The statue was, without question, a striking piece of work. A perfect replica of a Queen's Guard in full regalia. Red coat, black trousers, and, most noticeably, the iconic bearskin hat that made the guards at Buckingham Palace look like they had a small, dignified black bear resting peacefully atop their heads. The craftsmanship was impeccable. The posture, immaculate. The expression, utterly unreadable. Deborah tapped her pen against her clipboard and let out a slow exhale through her nose. She hated it. By 7:10 a.m., Nigel had received his violation notice. A crisp white envelope tucked neatly into his mailbox, informing him that his lawn ornament was in violation of Article 4, Section C, Subsection 12. No decorative or non-functional structures over 3 feet shall be placed on a residential lawn without HOA approval. At 7:12 a.m., Nigel read the notice. At 7:15 a.m., he placed it on his kitchen counter, made himself a cup of tea, and went about his morning as if nothing had happened. The first confrontation. By 9 a.m., Deborah was back. She rapped on Nigel's door with the precision of a woman who took great pride in her ability to be inconvenient before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. When Nigel opened the door, he was still dressed in his morning attire. A neatly pressed white button-up, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and black trousers. He looked as though he had either just finished a business meeting or was preparing to single-handedly negotiate a hostage situation with nothing but a cup of Earl Grey and sheer willpower. "Mr. Whitmore," Deborah said, voice tight, "I assume you've received the notice." "I have," Nigel replied, nodding once. And he regarded her with an expression that was equal parts polite and unreadable. "And what?" She blinked. "And you'll be removing it, yes?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, with the kind of slow deliberation that suggested he had given her question great and profound thought, Nigel said, "No." Deborah's nostrils flared. "No, no," Nigel confirmed. She pressed her lips into a thin line. "Mr. Whitmore, the HOA has strict guidelines about what can and cannot be displayed on a resident's lawn. Your statue," she said the word like it personally offended her, "is in violation of our policies." Nigel tilted his head ever so slightly. "I see. And if I may ask, what specific issue does the statue present?" Deborah scoffed. "It's an eyesore." Nigel's eyes flickered toward the statue, which, unlike a traditional eyesore, was impeccably crafted, professionally painted, and stood with the kind of military precision that suggested it could defend the home from enemy invasion if given the proper orders. "I disagree," he said simply. Deborah's left eye twitched. "It's against the rules." "Ah." He nodded once. "Yes, I read that in the notice." Deborah exhaled sharply. "Then you know that non-functional decorative structures above 3 feet must be approved by the HOA before placement." Yes. And did you get approval? No. Her smile was tight enough to cut glass. Then you'll be removing it. No. She was about 3 seconds away from bursting into flames. Mr. Whitmore. Forgive me, he interrupted smoothly, but I was under the impression that historical or cultural displays were permitted. Deborah scoffed. That is meant for things like small flags or commemorative plaques. Ah, I see. Nigel's expression remained unreadable. So, if my neighbor wished to place a statue of, say, George Washington on their lawn, that would be permitted? Deborah hesitated. That would be different. How so? She fumbled. Washington is a historical figure. Nigel's brow quirked ever so slightly. And a Queen's Guard is not. Deborah inhaled sharply through her nose. You have until the end of the week to remove it. Nigel nodded, considering this. Then, with a quiet hum, he said, I decline. And with that, he gently closed the door in her face. By that evening, the neighborhood was abuzz. Some homeowners whispered about that British fellow with the statue, while others secretly admired his dedication to lawn decor. Meanwhile, Deborah, fuming from the morning's interaction, convened an emergency HOA meeting. The consensus? This cannot stand. By the next morning, Nigel received a second letter, this time summoning him to an HOA tribunal, a kangaroo court of middle-aged bureaucrats who took their authority far too seriously. The date was set, the battle lines were drawn, and Nigel, utterly unfazed, carried on with his life as if he hadn't just been challenged to an administrative duel by a woman who listed HOA regulations under her hobbies. He sipped his tea, and he waited. The HOA tribunal was held in a windowless, overly air-conditioned conference room at the neighborhood community center. The walls were an unholy shade of beige, the kind that seemed to sap the very life force from whoever entered. A long folding table sat at the front of the room, where the HOA's self-appointed council perched like a flock of suburban vultures. In the center was Deborah Langley, HOA president and self-declared ruler of all things lawn-related. To her left, a man who looked like he had once dreamed of being a high-powered attorney, but had somehow ended up litigating disputes over improperly sized mailboxes. His name was Walter Clemens, and he was the HOA's lawyer, a man with the nervous energy of someone who had never won an argument with his wife. And then there was Nigel. Nigel arrived precisely 5 minutes early, dressed in a suit so crisply pressed it could have been used as a makeshift weapon. His tie was knotted with the precision of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of looking impervious to nonsense. He walked into the room, carrying himself with the calm authority of someone who had once been trusted to stand between the British monarchy and potential threats armed with nothing but discipline and an unbreakable stare. Then, without a word, he took his place at the defendant's table. And he stood, not sat, stood, perfectly straight, perfectly still, a human statue in the middle of a tribunal designed to strip him of his right to a statue. For a full 10 seconds, no one spoke. Walter shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at Deborah, who pursed her lips so tightly it looked like she had swallowed a lemon whole. Finally, Deborah cleared her throat. Mr. Whitmore, please take a seat. Nigel did not move. The silence stretched. Walter let out an awkward chuckle. Sir? You can sit. Nigel's voice, when it came, was steady and calm. I prefer to stand. Deborah pinched the bridge of her nose. Fine. She exhaled sharply and straightened the papers in front of her. This hearing has been called to discuss the violation in question. The placement of an unauthorized lawn ornament exceeding the approved height limit as set forth in Article 4, Section C, Subsection 12 of the Crestwood HOA regulations. Walter adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore, do you have legal representation present today? Nigel finally moved, just his eyes shifting to look directly at Walter with a gaze so intense it felt like he was peering into his very soul. Then, in a voice as smooth as it was devastating, he said, I am the representation. A beat of silence. Walter blinked. I'm sorry. Nigel remained motionless. I am representing myself. Deborah scoffed. Are you even qualified to? I have extensive knowledge of legal codes, bylaws, and procedural conduct, Nigel said smoothly. But more importantly, I have read the HOA's governing documents in full. Can you say the same? Deborah opened her mouth, then shut it. Walter shifted in his chair again, visibly sweating. Nigel continued, Given the nature of this proceeding, I will be treating it with the appropriate level of formality. That is to say, I will acknowledge the authority you believe you possess, but will proceed under the assumption that your decision-making process is deeply flawed. Deborah's nostrils flared. Excuse me. I will also be responding in kind. Nigel continued as if he had not been interrupted. If at any point I require legal clarification, I will provide it myself. If at any point I find the prosecution lacking, I will make it known. And if at any point this tribunal proves itself to be an utter waste of time, I will inform you with the appropriate amount of disdain. Walter coughed violently into his sleeve. Deborah's fingers curled into a fist on the table. Mr. Whitmore, I sincerely hope you don't think this is a joke. Nigel's face remained impassive. I assure you, madam, if I found this humorous, I would be laughing. Silence. Deborah inhaled deeply through her nose. Fine. She smoothed out her papers, giving Walter a pointed look that very clearly said, handle this. Walter nodded and shuffled his papers. Mr. Whitmore, are you aware that your lawn ornament violates the HOA's aesthetic guidelines? Nigel turned his head, slowly, deliberately, toward Walter. I'm aware of your interpretation of the guidelines, yes. Walter blinked. But it's written in the bylaws. Nigel gave a single, deliberate nod. Ah, the bylaws. His tone was unreadable. Tell me, Mr. Clemens, how thoroughly have you reviewed them? Walter hesitated. Well, Nigel did not wait for a response. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a full, leather-bound copy of the HOA's bylaws, complete with color-coded tabs and annotations. Walter visibly recoiled. Deborah's jaw clenched. Nigel placed the book on the table with the kind of reverence usually reserved for ancient artifacts. Then, with the precision of a man who had trained for years to stand in silence while chaos unfolded around him, he flipped to a specific page, tapped his index finger against the text, and said, Shall we begin? Walter looked like he wanted to be anywhere but there. Deborah gritted her teeth. And Nigel? Nigel stood tall, motionless, and utterly unshakable. The tribunal had begun. Walter Clemens, the HOA's lawyer, swallowed hard. He could already feel the sweat collecting at the back of his neck. He had entered this tribunal fully expecting to steamroll some suburban homeowner who got a little too attached to his ridiculous statue. Instead, he was now facing down a man who looked like he had been genetically engineered in a laboratory for the sole purpose of intimidating people in courtrooms. Nigel Whitmore stood at his designated spot, utterly unmoving, his gaze fixed on the HOA counsel with the unwavering intensity of a hawk watching a particularly stupid rabbit. Deborah Langley, the HOA president, cleared her throat. Let's move forward, she said sharply. Mr. Clemens, please present the HOA's case. Walter adjusted his tie, shuffled his papers, and launched into his pre-prepared opening statement. Mr. Whitmore's statue is in direct violation of the Crestwood HOA's aesthetic guidelines, he declared, regaining some of his confidence now that he was in familiar territory. Per Article 4, Section C, Subsection 12, all lawn ornaments must adhere to community standards regarding size, color, and historical context. He turned to Nigel, allowing himself a small smirk. Mr. Whitmore, are you aware that your statue violates these guidelines? Nigel did not blink. That depends. Walter frowned. Depends on what? On whether you've actually read those guidelines in full, Nigel said smoothly. Walter's confidence wavered. Nigel reached into his briefcase and, once again, withdrew the leather-bound, tabbed, and annotated HOA bylaws like he was a magician producing a rabbit from a hat. He flipped to a section with military precision, turned the book around, and slid it across the table toward Walter. Please, Nigel said, his voice calm, but with an undeniable air of challenge. Read the definition of aesthetic violation as outlined in your own bylaws. Walter hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he read aloud. Any lawn decoration, monument, or structure that significantly disrupts the visual harmony of the community, as determined by the Homeowners Association, shall be considered a violation of community aesthetic standards. Nigel gave a slow, approving nod. Very good. Now, tell me, Mr. Clemens, what exactly constitutes a significant disruption? Walter blinked. Well, Nigel interrupted. Is it defined anywhere in the bylaws? Walter fumbled through the pages, scanning quickly. His face paled. It doesn't specify. Nigel nodded again. Interesting. He turned to Deborah. So, if there is no official definition of a significant disruption, who decides what qualifies? Deborah bristled. The HOA board does. And is there a documented, objective standard you follow when making these decisions? Deborah's lips pressed into a thin line. Nigel tilted his head slightly. Or is it entirely subjective? Silence. Walter coughed. Deborah shifted uncomfortably. Nigel let the moment stretch just long enough before he reached for the book again, flipped to another tab section, and tapped his index finger against the page. Fortunately, your own bylaws provide guidance for situations where subjectivity could lead to inconsistent enforcement. Walter, against his better judgment, leaned forward to read. To maintain fairness and consistency, the HOA shall not enforce aesthetic violations arbitrarily or without precedent. Nigel nodded. So, let's establish precedent, shall we? Walter felt his stomach drop. Nigel folded his hands behind his back. Has the HOA ever approved or allowed any lawn statues in the past? Deborah hesitated. That's irrelevant. Answer the question, Nigel said evenly. Deborah inhaled sharply. Yes, but only small ones. Nigel nodded. Interesting. He turned another page in the bylaws, his movements precise and deliberate. Now, let's discuss exceptions to the aesthetic guidelines. Walter's breath caught. He had a very bad feeling about this. Nigel pointed to a highlighted section. According to Article 5, Section D, Subsection 3, historical and cultural displays shall be considered exceptions to standard aesthetic limitations, provided they maintain reasonable scale and placement. Walter's jaw tightened. Deborah paled. Nigel raised an eyebrow. Would you agree that this provision exists? Walter exhaled slowly. Yes. Nigel gave the smallest of nods. Wonderful. He paused. Then, with absolute precision, he delivered the question that would shake the foundation of this tribunal to its very core. Would this apply to, say, a statue of George Washington? Walter froze. Deborah made a noise that sounded vaguely like a strangled ferret. The entire HOA panel stiffened, suddenly very aware that they had walked directly into a trap. Nigel remained still as a statue, watching them process their mistake in real time. Walter opened and closed his mouth a few times before managing. That's different. Nigel's gaze sharpened. Ow! Walter floundered. Because George Washington is historical. Nigel's head tilted ever so slightly. And would you say the British Royal Guard is historical? Walter flinched. Nigel continued, his voice as steady as ever. Would you say that a full-size depiction of a historically significant figure from a globally recognized institution, known for its centuries-old tradition of discipline, service, and protection, qualifies as a historical display? Walter swallowed hard. Aye, because if you say no, Nigel continued, then you are directly contradicting your own bylaws. Walter's hands trembled slightly as he glanced at Deborah, who was gripping the arm of her chair with enough force to leave permanent imprints. Nigel allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form at the corner of his mouth. Deborah, now visibly flustered, waved a hand. We'll need to take this under consideration. Nigel inclined his head. Of course. Walter sagged in his chair, looking like a man who had just been hit by a slow-moving but unstoppable train of logic. Deborah, now desperate to regain control, slammed a hand on the table. Even if this were to be considered historical, the size of the statue is still in violation of height restrictions. Nigel turned another page. Walter audibly whimpered. The height limit, Nigel said smoothly. Would you care to explain how you determined that my statue exceeds it? Deborah hesitated. It's obvious. Obvious, Nigel mused. An interesting legal standard. Walter, visibly trembling, reached for his water bottle. Nigel remained utterly motionless, waiting for their next mistake. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room. This was not a tribunal. This was an annihilation. By this point, Walter Clemens, the HOA's lawyer, was visibly unraveling. His suit jacket, once crisply buttoned, had somehow become unfastened. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. His hands trembled as he tried to sip from his water bottle, which he had failed to realize was already empty. Meanwhile, Nigel Whitmore stood completely motionless. His posture remained as impeccable as ever, hands clasped neatly behind his back, eyes locked onto his opponent with the unwavering intensity of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of looking intimidating without saying a word. And then, with the slightest tilt of his head, he struck. Mr. Clemens, Nigel began, his voice as calm as a still lake before a storm. Before we proceed further, may I ask you a simple question? Walter swallowed. Yes. Nigel took a single step forward. Just one. but somehow it felt as though an entire battalion had just advanced. Would you say, Nigel continued, that you are familiar with Richards versus Glenwood HOA, 2009? Walter blinked rapidly. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. Nigel waited. Walter finally gave a weak chuckle. Well, I mean, there are a lot of HOA cases. So you're not familiar with it, Nigel stated. It wasn't a question. Walter's mouth snapped shut. Nigel gave an understanding nod, as if Walter had just confessed a deep personal failing. Unfortunate, he murmured. Let me enlighten you. He clasped his hands behind his back again. In Richards versus Glenwood HOA, the plaintiff, Mr. Richards, challenged an HOA's arbitrary enforcement of aesthetic guidelines, very much like our current case. The ruling, if I recall correctly, stated that a homeowners association cannot selectively apply aesthetic restrictions without clearly documented precedent or a standardized process. He paused for effect. Would you like me to quote the ruling verbatim? Walter, now visibly trembling, croaked, that won't be necessary. Nigel continued anyway. An HOA cannot enforce community guidelines in a manner that is inconsistent, arbitrary, or targeted at individual homeowners without just cause. To do so constitutes a breach of contract and an overreach of authority. Nigel's eyes never wavered. Would you like me to cite the judge's name as well? Walter just shook his head, looking dangerously close to unaliving himself out of sheer embarrassment. Nigel let the silence linger before casually flipping through his leather-bound HOA bylaw book, landing on another highlighted section. Let's move forward, he said smoothly. Mr. Clemens, are you familiar with Sutter versus Willow Creek HOA, 2013? Walter's eye twitched. Deborah Langley, the HOA president, leaned forward aggressively. This is irrelevant. Nigel turned his gaze to her so slowly that it might as well have been the climax of a horror movie. Deborah immediately leaned back. Walter, seeing no way out, let out a quiet sigh. No, I'm not familiar with that case either. Nigel tilted his head slightly. Well, in that case, he recited it from memory. In Sutter versus Willow Creek HOA, the ruling determined that when an HOA's bylaws contain ambiguous language, the interpretation most favorable to the homeowner must be applied. This was reaffirmed in Manning versus Fairway Estates HOA, 2016. Walter's soul visibly left his body. Deborah's fingers twitched as though she wanted to strangle someone. Possibly Walter, possibly herself, possibly a time traveler who had failed to prevent this moment from happening. Nigel, unbothered, continued. Would you like a third case? Walter dropped his pen. Nigel took that as a no. He gave a polite nod. Very well. He flipped another page in his impeccably annotated bylaws and casually turned the book around, sliding it across the table like he had just laid down a royal flush. Now then, he said, shall we discuss enforcement bias? Walter made a tiny, strangled noise. Deborah sucked in a sharp breath. This is completely... Shall I cite precedent? Nigel asked. Deborah shut her mouth. Nigel took his time adjusting his sleeves before continuing, as though he had all the time in the world and absolutely no chance of losing. You see, he said, what I find particularly fascinating is that the HOA has previously approved multiple yard decorations, including, if I recall correctly, a 5-foot-tall cement flamingo in Mrs. Abernathy's garden. Walter blinked. The flamingo? Nigel nodded. Yes, the flamingo. Deborah's nostrils flared. That's different. Nigel's gaze sharpened. Ow! Deborah hesitated. Nigel clasped his hands neatly behind his back again. Because if the HOA allows a cement flamingo, but not a historically significant statue, then I believe we have established a pattern of arbitrary enforcement. Walter visibly crumpled. Nigel let the silence settle. Then, as though delivering the final stroke of a master painting, he stated, This case is no longer about my statue. Walter looked up sharply. This case is about whether the HOA has been making inconsistent, biased, and legally questionable decisions. Deborah turned pale. Nigel pressed forward. If the HOA does not enforce rules consistently, then every previous ruling they've made is subject to legal challenge. Walter audibly whimpered. I imagine, Nigel said, tilting his head slightly, that some of the homeowners in this neighborhood would be quite interested in that information. Deborah looked physically ill. Nigel took one step back, returning to his pristine military stance. Then, with absolute precision, he delivered the final blow. I move for an immediate dismissal of this case, on the grounds of inconsistent enforcement, lack of procedural clarity, and blatant legal overreach. Silence. Walter, who now resembled a man who had just aged 10 years in one afternoon, turned to Deborah. Deborah, looking as though she wanted to scream, but had momentarily forgotten how, glared at him. Walter looked back at Nigel. Nigel blinked once. Walter slowly turned back to Deborah and, in a barely audible voice, muttered, "He's right. Walter Clemens was having the worst day of his legal career." Scratch that. Walter Clemens was having the worst day of his entire life. He had woken up that morning thinking this would be a simple case. A slam dunk. A routine HOA dispute over some ridiculous lawn ornament. He hadn't even bothered preparing. Why would he? This was Nigel Whitmore, an ex-royal guard, not a lawyer. How hard could it possibly be to outmaneuver a man whose entire skill set involved standing still? Very. It was very hard. Walter's once pristine notes were now a crumpled mess, full of panic scribbles like he knows case law and do not make eye contact. His opening arguments had collapsed under the sheer weight of Nigel's unflinching legal assault, and now he was losing it. The courtroom had settled into a tense silence, except for the quiet but unmistakable sound of Walter sweating. Across the room, Nigel hadn't moved an inch. Not to check his notes, not to shift his weight, not even to blink excessively. Just standing there, perfectly, utterly, motionless. Walter tried to press on. I'd like to remind the court that the defendant's statue is in clear violation of the HOA's guidelines regarding acceptable lawn decor. Nigel remained completely still. Walter swallowed. Additionally, the defendant has failed to comply with multiple notices demanding removal of the statue. Nigel didn't even twitch. Walter's breath hitched. Somewhere in his subconscious, a deep primal part of his brain, one that had spent millennia evolving to detect threats, began screaming. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Clemens, are you all right?" Walter let out a high-pitched chuckle. It was meant to sound casual. It did not sound casual. "Of course, Your Honor. He gestured vaguely toward Nigel, concerned that Mr. Whitmore is, ease. The judge raised an eyebrow. "He's what?" Walter gestured again, more aggressively this time. "He's just standing there, menacingly, a beat." The judge squinted at Nigel, who remained as still as a perfectly calibrated marble statue. Then the judge shrugged. "Seems fine to me." Walter's left eye twitched. Nigel tilted his head exactly 1 millimeter to the left. Walter nearly screamed. Deborah Langley, the HOA president, leaned over and hissed, "Pull yourself together." Walter wiped his forehead. "I am very together." "No, you're losing it." Walter tried to protest, but at that exact moment, Nigel inhaled. Walter flinched so hard he nearly fell backward. Deborah buried her face in her hands. Walter needed to regain control. He shuffled his notes, searching desperately for something, anything that could turn this case back in his favor. And then he found it. Yes, of course, he muttered under his breath, regaining his confidence. He turned to the judge with renewed vigor. "Your Honor, I would like to remind the court that the HOA's bylaws explicitly prohibit personal monuments." He smirked triumphantly, daring Nigel to wiggle out of that one. Nigel did not wiggle. Instead, he exhaled slowly, then said, in his usual calm and utterly devastating tone, "Mr. Clemens, may I direct your attention to page 47, subsection B of the HOA bylaws." Walter hesitated. "Why?" "Because," Nigel said smoothly, "you will find that it allows for historical and cultural displays, provided they meet specific criteria." Walter's stomach dropped. "That doesn't apply to personal monuments." Deborah interjected, desperate to salvage what little remained of their argument. Nigel turned his gaze to her. "Would this apply to, say, a statue of George Washington?" Deborah's mouth snapped shut. Walter's smirk vanished. The judge looked intrigued. "That is an interesting question." "No, it's not," Walter blurted. The judge gave him a long, slow look. Walter forced a smile. It's not relevant. That's what I meant. Because obviously George Washington is." Nigel cut him off. "So you do admit that the rule allows for statues deemed historically significant?" Walter hesitated. "Well, technically, but—" And Nigel continued, "You acknowledge that I am a former member of the British Royal Guard?" Walter narrowed his eyes. "Yes, but I fail to see how—" "My statue," Nigel said smoothly, "is of a Royal Guard." Silence. "Specifically," Nigel added, "a historically accurate representation of a long-standing institution recognized by multiple governments." The judge turned to Walter. That does sound quite historical. Walter opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. That's not the same. Ow, Nigel asked. Walter felt the walls closing in. Because it's not George Washington, he blurted. The courtroom went dead silent. Even Deborah was now staring at him in horror. The judge pinched the bridge of his nose. Mr. Clemens, are you honestly trying to argue that historical relevance is limited solely to George Washington? Walter's soul left his body. Well, that's not exactly. Nigel adjusted his cufflinks. Walter lost it. He's doing it again. The judge sighed. Mr. Clemens, please compose yourself. Walter jabbed a shaky finger at Nigel. He's psychologically attacking me. The judge rubbed his temples. By standing still? Yes. I fail to see how that's possible. Walter pointed furiously. Look at him. The entire courtroom looked at Nigel. Nigel remained as still as a marble statue. Walter flung his arms in the air. How is that not menacing? The judge sighed deeply and turned to Nigel. Mr. Whitmore, I must ask, are you doing anything intentionally to intimidate Mr. Clemens? Nigel blinked once. No, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Very well, please proceed. Walter's soul audibly shattered. Deborah, who had now completely abandoned ship, muttered under her breath, We are so screwed. Walter, looking wild-eyed and defeated, dropped into his chair like a man who had just fought an uphill battle against a legally invincible statue impersonator. Nigel, sensing total victory, simply adjusted his tie and said, No further arguments, Your Honor. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the faintest crinkle of Walter Clemens' last shred of dignity collapsing in on itself. The judge had spoken. The verdict was in, and it was devastating. Not only is Mr. Whitmore allowed to keep his statue, the judge announced, adjusting his glasses, but the HOA will be required to reimburse him for all legal fees associated with this case. Walter's soul left his body. Deborah, the HOA president, made a strangled, choking sound. The other HOA board members, who had spent most of the trial gradually sinking into their chairs like melting candle wax, looked around, suddenly desperate for an escape route. Nigel remained perfectly still. Walter, who had already aged 10 years in the last hour, made one final, pitiful attempt. Why, Your Honor? He gulped. Surely that's not necessary. The judge peered at him over the rim of his glasses. Are you arguing against reimbursing a defendant who had to defend himself against a case you clearly had no legal standing to bring? Walter opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His brain had reached critical failure. The judge sighed. Motion denied. The courtroom doors creaked open, and the HOA's slow, shameful march of defeat began. Walter moved like a man who had just been hit by a legal freight train. Deborah was muttering to herself like a woman whose life choices had come back to haunt her all at once. One of the other board members looked up at the ceiling, as though silently praying to an HOA god that had clearly abandoned them. And Nigel? Nigel was exactly as he had been the entire time. Unmoving, unflinching, unconquered. As Nigel reached the doorway, he paused. Without turning around, he spoke in the same perfectly measured, unshaken tone he had used throughout the trial. Oh, and one more thing. The HOA board members froze. Walter, already spiritually hollowed out, turned slowly. Nigel finally moved. Just a small turn of his head. Just enough to glance back at them. And then, with the quiet authority of a man who had just single-handedly ruined their entire week, he said, Your mailbox violates City Ordinance 403B. The words hung in the air. Deborah's mouth fell open. What? Nigel blinked, completely unbothered. You have 30 days to remove it. Walter's knees buckled. Deborah grabbed the back of a chair for support. A board member whispered a prayer. The HOA had lost everything. And now, their own precious mailbox was about to be torn down by the very same bureaucratic nightmare they had tried to unleash upon Nigel. The weight of it crushed them. Walter shook his head in disbelief. How did he even? Deborah, still gripping the chair, hissed, He's a monster. Nigel walked out, perfectly still, perfectly composed, and the only sound that followed him was the agonized groan of a defeated HOA.